Our neighborhood is supposed to be safe. Quiet streets lined with neat houses, trimmed lawns, and kids riding their bikes under the watchful eyes of parents chatting on front porches. When I moved here with my daughter 2 years ago, I thought it was the perfect place to raise her. A community where neighbors look out for one another, where children play freely without worry. My little girl, only 5 years old, was beginning to make friends and explore the world around her with the bright curiosity only a child can have. I watched her laughing under the warm sun as she chased bubbles or made daisy chains in the park. It was the kind of childhood I had dreamed of giving her. But beneath the calm surface, not everything was as peaceful as it seemed. There was always a certain tension around one particular family. Karen, the woman everyone called the HOA Karen, was known for her sharp tongue and strict rules. She carried herself like the self-appointed ruler of our small community, quick to complain and slow to forgive. Her son, a boy just a few years older than my daughter, had a reputation that unsettled many parents. Whispers about his wild behavior floated from backyard fences and spilled into casual conversations at school drop-offs. I had seen the way he stormed down the street, yelling and throwing tantrums, but I had never expected it to come so close to home. Until that day. Until the moment that changed everything. I wish I could say it was a freak accident, a moment of poor judgment or careless play, but what happened to my daughter felt deliberate, a violent collision of recklessness and neglect. And as the neighbors gathered, I heard Karen's chilling excuse, brushing it off with a cold shrug and the words, "Boys will be boys." Those words still haunt me, because they did not just dismiss the pain of my child, they tried to erase it. Karen was the kind of woman who made her presence known without saying much. She had this way of scanning the neighborhood like a hawk, always watching, always judging. I first noticed her soon after we moved in. She stood in front of her house, arms crossed, wearing a tight expression like she was waiting for someone to break one of her endless list of rules. Everyone called her the HOA Karen, not just because she was on the board, but because she seemed to take her role as the neighborhood's self-appointed enforcer very seriously. Her voice carried easily, sharp and unforgiving whenever she spoke to anyone who didn't meet her expectations. Her son was a different story entirely. From the moment I met him, there was something off. He was about 8 years old, bigger than most kids his age, with a wild look in his eyes that made me uneasy. He moved with restless energy, like he was always on the edge of exploding. The other parents whispered about his behavior, warning to keep their children away. He was known for being aggressive, throwing tantrums that left playgrounds in chaos. Sometimes I saw him shouting at other kids or pushing them too hard. Karen never seemed to discipline him in public. Instead, she waved off his outbursts like they were nothing important. It felt as though she expected the world to put up with his bad behavior without question. Despite all the warnings, I tried to keep an open mind. Kids can be rough sometimes, and I hoped maybe he just needed some guidance. I even tried to make friendly conversation with Karen once or twice, hoping to build some goodwill. But she was cold and dismissive, never interested in talking, except to remind me about some trivial rule or complain about my daughter playing too close to her lawn. The tension between us was quiet but real. There were small incidents before that day, times when her son had pushed my daughter or grabbed toys without asking. Each time I tried to talk to Karen, she would brush it off with that familiar phrase, "Boys will be boys." She acted like it was no big deal, like my daughter just needed to toughen up. But I saw the fear growing in my daughter's eyes. I knew something had to change. I just didn't know how badly things were going to get. The morning had started like any other. The sun was shining softly through the kitchen window as I packed a small backpack for my daughter, Emma. She was bursting with energy, her favorite pink dress swirling as she twirled around the living room, her laughter filling the air. I had promised her a trip to the neighborhood park after breakfast, and she was already dreaming of the swings and the sandbox. It felt like a perfect day to be outside, to watch her play and forget the worries that sometimes shadowed this neighborhood. We walked hand in hand down the quiet streets, the grass still damp with morning dew beneath our feet. Emma skipped ahead a little, chasing butterflies and picking up dandelions. The park wasn't far from our house, and already a few other children were there with their parents. It was the kind of place where you expected smiles and laughter, not tension or trouble. I noticed Karen standing by her front porch, arms crossed, watching the park through narrowed eyes. Her son was nearby, running around in circles with a wild, reckless energy that made my stomach twist. Emma had barely glanced at him, but I knew he had his eyes on her. His movements were sharp and unpredictable. I tried to keep my attention on Emma, but something about the way he looked unsettled me. Emma wandered close to the sandbox, where a group of children were playing quietly. I settled onto a bench nearby, keeping my eyes on her, but my mind was uneasy. Suddenly, I heard a loud shout and a crash. I looked up just in time to see Karen's son lunging toward Emma, his face twisted in anger. He grabbed her arm roughly, and Emma let out a startled cry. I jumped up and ran toward them, heart pounding. I shouted at the boy to stop, but he ignored me, pulling Emma away from the others. She struggled, trying to break free, but he was too strong. Then came the sound that will haunt me forever, the sickening thud as Emma hit the ground hard. She didn't move. The world slowed around me as I dropped to my knees beside her, panic rising in my throat. Her eyes fluttered open, confused and scared. She tried to sit up, but her body was limp, and she couldn't speak. I felt her head trembling against the rough grass, a growing warmth spreading beneath her. Tears blurred my vision as I called 911, my voice shaking as I explained what had happened. Karen appeared, calm and detached, her face unreadable. She said something to her son in a low voice, but he just stared at me with a blank expression. When I demanded she take responsibility, she shrugged and muttered the phrase I had heard too many times before. Boys will be boys. It was like a slap to my face. The ambulance arrived quickly, paramedics rushing to assess Emma. I held her small hand as they worked, her skin cold despite the heat of the day. They carefully lifted her onto a stretcher and loaded her into the vehicle. I climbed in beside her, whispering promises to stay strong, to fight, though I barely knew how to hold myself together. At the hospital, the doctors ran tests, their faces grim. The words, brain injury, echoed in the sterile room, making my chest tighten with fear. Emma was moved to the intensive care unit, tubes and machines surrounding her fragile body. I sat by her side, refusing to leave, watching for any sign that she was still with me. The hours stretched endlessly, each minute a battle against despair. My mind raced with questions and fury. How could this happen in a place that was supposed to be safe? How could a mother dismiss such a serious injury with a careless phrase? I felt alone, abandoned by the people who should have protected my daughter. I replayed the moment over and over. Every detail burned into my memory. The wild look in that boy's eyes, the cruel calmness in Karen's voice, the helplessness in Emma's small frame. This was no accident. This was the result of neglect and denial. That day shattered the peaceful world I had tried to create for Emma. It showed me how fragile safety can be and how easily it can be stolen by those who refuse to take responsibility. But even in the darkest moments, I clung to hope that Emma would recover, that justice would be served, and that no other child would have to suffer like she did. The minutes after the fall felt like an eternity. I stayed on my knees beside Emma, trembling as I held her limp hand in mine. Her breath was shallow, and she barely responded to my voice. I kept calling her name softly, trying to reach her, to pull her back from whatever darkness was creeping in. Around us, other parents and children froze, unsure whether to step forward or back away. The weight of the moment was crushing. My mind was racing, but my body felt frozen in place. The emergency responders arrived quickly, but to me it felt like they were moving through slow motion. Paramedics knelt beside us, speaking in calm but urgent voices. They checked her pulse, her breathing, and gently turned her head to keep her airway clear. I answered their questions the best I could, my voice breaking as I explained what had happened. The boy who hurt her was nowhere to be seen, and Karen stood at a distance, arms folded, watching with an unreadable expression. I felt a fierce wave of anger toward her. When I confronted her about what had happened, she barely flinched. Instead, she shrugged and said those words again, as if repeating a tired excuse would make it true. Boys will be boys. Her tone was cold, dismissive, and it felt like a punch to the gut. How could she be so indifferent? How could she brush off something so serious when my daughter lay there, barely conscious and bleeding? The paramedics lifted Emma onto a stretcher with practiced care. I climbed into the ambulance beside her, clutching her small hand, my heart pounding with fear. The ride to the hospital was a blur of flashing lights and sirens, but all I could focus on was her fragile body next to mine. I whispered over and over that I loved her, that she needed to fight, that I was right there with her. At the emergency room, doctors took over, moving swiftly and efficiently. They ran tests, took scans, and ordered more exams to understand the extent of the injury. I was led into a sterile waiting area, my hands shaking as I tried to hold myself together. The doctor's words were heavy with seriousness when they finally came to talk to me. They told me Emma had suffered a traumatic brain injury and that she was being admitted to the intensive care unit. They explained the risks and the uncertain road ahead. I felt numb. My world tilted and fractured in ways I never imagined. My brave little girl was fighting for her life, and all I could do was wait and hope. The hospital staff were kind, but their professionalism only reminded me of the severity of the situation. I called my family and close friends, telling them what had happened and asking them to come. Their voices were full of shock and sadness, and their presence became a lifeline in that dark time. I also reached out to neighbors, hoping someone would stand with me, but I sensed a cold distance from many. The support I needed was nowhere to be found where I expected it most. Through the long hours that followed, I sat beside Emma's hospital bed. The beeping machines and tubes were frightening reminders of how fragile she was. Every tiny movement she made brought a surge of hope. I held her hand, stroked her hair, and talked to her like she could hear me. I promised her I would not let her go, that I would fight to keep her safe. That night, sleep was impossible. The images of the attack replayed endlessly in my mind. I thought about Karen's careless excuse, the boy's reckless violence, and the devastating consequences. How could anyone dismiss this with a shrug? How could the people around us pretend it was just a normal part of growing up when a child was lying broken and vulnerable? I realized then that this was more than an accident. It was a failure to protect, a refusal to take responsibility, and a community turning its back on one of its own. The road ahead would be long and painful, but I knew I had to stay strong. For Emma, for our family, and for every parent who trusted their child would be safe in their own neighborhood. No matter what came next, I was ready to fight. After the ambulance left, the neighborhood seemed to hold its breath. I stood in the driveway, staring at the empty space where Emma had been moments before. Karen was nearby, standing with that same cold look on her face, as if nothing had happened. I felt a surge of anger rise inside me, but also a deep sadness that this woman could be so indifferent to what her son had done. I walked over to her, my voice shaking but determined. I asked how she could let her son behave like that, how she could stand there and say, "Boys will be boys," while my daughter was hurt so badly she needed to be rushed to the hospital. Her eyes flickered with something unreadable, and she said again that boys will be boys, that children sometimes act out and it wasn't anything personal. I wanted to scream. Those words felt like a slap in the face, a dismissal of everything I was feeling, everything my daughter was going through. The neighbors started to gather, some curious, some sympathetic, but many just watching quietly. I could see the discomfort on their faces, the way they avoided looking directly at me or Karen. When I tried to speak with a few of them, I found the responses frustrating. Some said they didn't want to get involved. Others suggested it was just kids being kids and that I should try to move on. A few offered support quietly, telling me they were sorry and that they hoped Emma would be okay. But the majority seemed reluctant to take sides, as if the peace of the neighborhood was more important than justice for my daughter. I decided to bring the matter to the HOA board. I knew Karen had a position there, and I hoped that would mean someone would listen. The meeting was tense from the start. Karen sat with a tight smile, clearly prepared to defend herself and her son. When I told the board what happened and how Karen had dismissed the incident, some members nodded in understanding, but others seemed uncomfortable. One board member suggested that children's rough play was hard to police and that accidents happen. I argued that this was not rough play but a violent attack, and that ignoring it put all the children at risk. My voice grew stronger as I spoke, but inside I felt tired and drained. The board agreed to discuss the issue further, promising to look into the situation and to review the neighborhood rules regarding child behavior and supervision. I left the meeting with mixed feelings. There was some hope that action might be taken, but I also sensed the undercurrent of denial and unwillingness to confront the truth. Karen remained unbothered, continuing her role in the HOA as if nothing had changed. Back at home, the emotional toll began to weigh heavily on me. My husband tried to stay strong for the family, but I could see the worry in his eyes. Our other children were confused and scared, asking questions I didn't have answers to. Friends and family rallied around us, offering support, but the silence and avoidance from neighbors made me feel isolated. It was hard to reconcile the image of a close-knit community with the reality of how easily people turned away from the pain right outside their doors. As days passed, I received messages from a few parents who said their children had also experienced unsettling encounters with Karen's son. Some had chosen not to speak up before, fearing backlash or social isolation. Hearing their stories gave me a bittersweet sense of solidarity and frustration. How many others had been hurt or scared, but no one had acted? How long had this been going on beneath the surface? I reached out to a local child advocate and a lawyer to understand my options. I wanted to make sure Emma's injury would not be ignored, that the family would be held accountable, and that steps would be taken to protect other children. It was a difficult path to begin, filled with uncertainty and emotional exhaustion. Yet, the injustice of Karen's dismissal fueled my resolve. Through it all, I kept returning to Emma's fragile hospital bed. Every moment away from her was a reminder of what was at stake. The community's silence felt like a betrayal, but I knew I had to be louder. For Emma, for my family, and for every parent who deserved to trust their neighborhood would keep their children safe. I would not let this go unanswered. The days after Emma's injury unfolded in a blur of hospital visits, whispered conversations, and sleepless nights. I found myself caught in a storm of emotions that I never imagined I would have to face. Fear was the most immediate, a raw, piercing fear that gripped my heart every time I saw the machines beeping next to her bed or watched her lying so still and fragile. She was my little girl, full of life and laughter, and now she was fighting for something as precious and fragile as her own brain. That fear settled deep inside me, growing heavier with each uncertain update from the doctors. Alongside fear, there was a seething anger that refused to fade. I thought about Karen's son, the reckless boy who had hurt my daughter, and about Karen herself. How could she stand by and dismiss this with such coldness? Her careless words, "Boys will be boys," echoed in my mind like a cruel mantra, twisting the pain into frustration. It wasn't just the injury that hurt me. It was the denial and the refusal to take responsibility. The way she acted as if this was nothing more than a childish accident cut deeper than I could have ever expected. It was a slap in the face to every parent who trusted this neighborhood to be a safe place for their children. The community's response, lack of one, was another wound I had to grapple with. I had expected neighbors to rally around us, to stand together in support of Emma, but instead I found silence and avoidance. Some pretended it wasn't their problem, while others looked away to keep the peace. It felt like I was standing alone against an invisible wall of indifference. The very people who shared this neighborhood with us seemed unwilling to confront the reality of what had happened. That loneliness made the fear and anger feel even more suffocating. My family bore the weight of this too. My husband tried to hold us all together, but I could see the strain behind his calm words. Our other children were confused and scared, asking questions I struggled to answer. How do you explain to young children that the world can be unfair and sometimes cruel? That the person who hurt their sister might never truly face the consequences? I felt overwhelmed by the responsibility to protect them all while grappling with my own heartbreak. At night, when the house was quiet, I found myself replaying the events over and over. I thought about how quickly everything changed, how a moment that should have been filled with innocent play turned into a nightmare. I questioned myself, wondering if there was something I missed, something I could have done differently. The guilt was a shadow that followed me, even though I knew in my heart I had done everything I could. It was the kind of guilt that makes you doubt your own strength and decisions. Yet even in the darkest moments, a stubborn hope refused to die. Emma was a fighter, and every small sign of progressor fingers twitching, her eyes tracking movement, became a beacon of light. I clung to those moments, holding on to the belief that she could recover, that she could come back to us. It was a hope that kept me awake during those long nights and gave me the strength to face each day. I also found myself thinking deeply about what this experience meant beyond my own family. The phrase, "boys will be boys," was not just a dismissive excuse. It was a dangerous mindset that allowed harmful behavior to go unchecked. It made me angry to realize how many children, like my Emma, might suffer quietly because adults refused to take responsibility. This wasn't just about one boy or one family, it was about a culture that excuses violence and neglect. Through all the fear, anger, and sadness, I became determined to make change. Not just for Emma's sake, but for every child who deserves to be safe and protected. I wanted to raise my voice against the denial and the indifference, to stand up in a way I never thought I would have to. It was hard work, and some days the weight felt unbearable, but I knew I could not give up. This ordeal reshaped everything: my understanding of safety, of community, and of what it means to fight for the ones you love. It taught me how fragile life is, and how fierce a mother's love can be when everything is on the line. The path ahead was uncertain and filled with challenges, but I was ready to walk it, step by step, with Emma in my heart. After weeks of uncertainty, the small signs of Emma's progress began to bring a cautious hope into our lives. Each tiny movement, each flicker of recognition in her eyes felt like a victory against the darkness that had threatened to consume her. The doctors remained careful with their words, reminding us that recovery from a brain injury is often a long and unpredictable journey. Still, I held on to every glimmer of improvement, drawing strength from Emma's resilience even when I felt utterly exhausted. Our days settled into a rhythm of hospital visits, therapy sessions, and endless waiting. I spent hours by Emma's bedside, reading her favorite stories and playing soft music to comfort her. Her small hand in mine became a symbol of our unbreakable bond, and my promise to fight for her no matter what. At home, my husband managed everything else, supporting our other children and handling the affairs that demanded our attention. We leaned on each other more than ever, trying to hold together a life that felt fragile and uncertain. The community's silence still stung, but I refused to let it silence me. I began reaching out to local organizations that support families affected by childhood injuries and violence. Their advice and encouragement reminded me that we were not alone, and that there were people willing to help us navigate the difficult path ahead. I found solace in connecting with others who had faced similar struggles, sharing stories of pain but also of hope and resilience. I also made the decision to pursue legal action against Karen's family. It was not an easy choice, but it was necessary. I wanted to ensure that accountability was demanded and that no other child would suffer because of negligence or denial. My lawyer helped me understand the complexities of the process, and though it was daunting, I felt empowered by taking steps to protect Emma's future. The thought of facing Karen and her family in court filled me with apprehension, but I knew I had to be brave for Emma's sake. The HOA board held a meeting to address the incident, and while progress was slow, there were commitments made to implement stricter rules around child supervision and behavior in the neighborhood. I spoke at the meeting, sharing my story and urging the community to recognize the serious consequences of ignoring dangerous behavior. Some neighbors voiced support, and I felt a small but meaningful shift. Change would not come overnight, but it had begun. Throughout all of this, I tried to focus on the future, on the possibilities that lay ahead for Emma. The road to recovery would be long and full of challenges, but with the right care and support, there was hope. I researched therapies, specialists, and support groups, determined to give her every chance to heal and thrive. I promised myself that I would be her strongest advocate, no matter how difficult the fight. There were moments of despair and exhaustion, but also moments of unexpected joy. A smile, a response, a small step forward reminded me why I could never give up. Emma had already survived so much, and I believed she had the strength to keep fighting. Our family learned to take each day as it came, celebrating progress no matter how small, and holding tightly to the hope that guided us through the darkest times. This experience changed me in ways I never expected. It showed me the depths of a mother's love and the power of resilience in the face of tragedy. It taught me that hope is not just a feeling, but a choice that I would make every day for Emma and for the future we were still building together.